Hello everyone, today we talk again of the First Crusade. And yes, we made a video just recently about it. It happened like this because I choose my topics randomly and it came out once again. This one, but, and it's not definitely the first time we make another video about the First Crusade. I think we made like 4 very briefly that we didn't do last time, and that we will definitely expand on also in our medieval warfare videos, etc. And I think the topic of the First Crusade and the establishment of the Outremer states is, a topic it really deserves. As I often said, and despite being a medievalist, never got particularly interested in the Crusades per se, right? And yet the more I read about it, and the more I get fascinated by the relative by the difficulty, first of all, that we have in framing them correctly, like first of all, even knowing what the hell happened, right? I'm talking about the major political and military events that are more or less clear, more or less, by the way, and the thing is definitely way more complicated than it's also often, we often also synthesize in here, because there were lots of different expeditions, and the whole political balance of the Crusader states varied dramatically over time, and it was at the same base of the broader international balance of the whole Europe, Mediterranean, Near East, and even beyond, right? So to make a history of the Crusades in a thorough way that we wouldn't have the time or the space. Like, I don't think it's something you can do on YouTube, right? Yeah, I know there are channels that specialize in Crusades, but also they try to make a synthesis, because very often even the most what appears like just a small engagement has behind it a lot of broader issues, right? Politically, strategically, and these things should be studied with a broader, either with a single PhD, if there is still to, I'm not suggesting that people have still not done it, but that the strictly military perspective is not excessively explored in the academy compared to other fields, and also hyper specialization doesn't help to get a bit, to get this more comprehensive picture of the Crusades per se, I would say, as a from the military point of view. That's also why we expand on the strictly military history of the story with this series that we do since more than 1 year now. But and we will keep naturally observing this, always realizing that I suppose in the Crusades there's not let's say, I don't want to be misunderstood, but I don't think there is something extremely special as an essential difference, right? As an essential character to what was happening largely before and after the Crusade as such. This is more or less I expand a little bit more on the perspective, because we have already told certain things, but the idea that the Crusades, after all, are nothing particularly strange, right? It's obvious that ideologically speaking, we, for many reasons, we, in basically all over, Western, I presume also Islamic historiography, we tend to explore them as a sort of trying to find answers to contemporary problems and this kind of stuff, but I really don't think that's the right way of addressing the Crusades, right? Not because these things were not ideologically driven, not because these wars were not motivated by religious factors, but if you observe what the world was at the time, and we said it many times, this was the normality, right? Just like I said in the other video, like, why do we have to label the Crusades as a religious war, where actually every single war at the time was fought in the name of God? And every single one, including the one between Christians and between Muslims at the same time. That's kind of weird, right? And I think, of course, if you want to explore the religious side of the Crusades, there is an astonishing amount to know, to learn. But there is also so much else, and there is also this realization that trying to chop down pre-modern history as if, there were certain chapters that were essentially different from one another, when you realize how homogeneous societies actually were pretty much everywhere at that point, and how certain political and military and social dynamics were similar sometimes. Why stopping to the idea that, okay, let's just reason within the tank of the crusade per se, right? Or just of the interreligious struggle, where there is, when the obvious depth of any, not even just political, but just a strategic analysis is sufficient to prove you wrong under this point of view, right? That this was connected with literally everything that was happening in the Middle East, in Europe, in the Mediterranean, aside from the interreligionary struggle. I mean, besides the interreligionary struggle, and as an enormously complex reasons of that go from the internal problems of the respective societies, the political ambitions of their rulers, trade that was intensifying like crazy in these areas, and this really widens the horizon for a healthy assessment of these chapters, right? And of course the Crusades are unique in their own regard, like any other event, right? And of course it's important to understand their specificity, as long as you understand, however, the base, and therefore also the most important substance of this whole thing, that is, as we were saying, homogeneous fundamentally to all the other political and social business and military business of the world. So it's kind of embarrassing to repeat even certain things. Of course, we don't think we have to repeat about the appeal launched at Clermont-Ferrand by Urban II. Rather, I would like to stress this, about which we don't know much, as we were saying last time. Like, don't think that the Council of Clermont is actually the staged episode that we find in later chronicles. We know basically almost nothing really about what was told at the time. Most of what we know actually is about it has been written even centuries after that, after the Crusades had been built also ideologically in a certain specific way. I say it every time. The term crusade is born in the 13th century. Before that, it wasn't conceived even in the terms it was conceived at the time. Also, Crusades didn't stop in 1291, as you know, and we have this idea, the age of Crusades stopped, and then began the one of the late, Middle Ages, the early modern. No, really. I mean, Crusades is something that went on till well into the 18th century. I mean, and you it's always very important to stress how in fact the religious element here was central in a way that has not specifically to do with that, if you want, narrow theater that the Near Eastern, I don't know how you want to call them, Crusades have been between the 11th and the 13th century. And also, frankly, the same area was invested by further expeditions. We made several videos about even modern attempts from the side of Europe to reconquer the Near East, Jerusalem, etc. So the religious matter is central. The Crusades were like a normal paradigm and necessity and objective that it was proper of Christian society up to, in fact, the modern times and beyond. And the same goes naturally for the jihad and the Islamic, let's say, fort towards, for expanding the Muslim world. And naturally also that perspective we didn't cover much, but it's fascinating because, as we often recall, the Islamic world was actually much more problematic from a political and military point of view than the Christian one. Actually, Europe during the Crusades began also to manage a broader theater, right, to it's the same centuries of the consolidation of the feudal monarchies, of their kind of intercontinental capacity of strategic vision, let's say, and also projection capability. Even if you think about the same First Crusade, that was an amazing feat for the logistics of the times. And when people say, that basically Europe woke up all of a sudden with the First Crusade, and it took to conquer Jerusalem to eventually being, woken up even intellectually from this broader Eastern. You look at what the Westerners did at that point, you realize that they didn't need basically anyone to teach them what to achieve and not to achieve. The history of First Crusade is astonishing, right? It could have gone otherwise. It was about to fail at many moments. But the fact that it was accomplished shows such a development in the political and military culture of the West that is astonishing. And naturally with the social basis that allowed it to do, and sorry if I interrupt, but I think I just missed one part at a few minutes at the beginning in the montage. I didn't save the audio while recording actually, and I jump here from topic to topic, so please today have patience. I hope there will not be any further problem in this regard. But you understand here what the critical dimension of Crusading history could extend to, right? If really one wants to deepen this stuff, and it's obvious that it sounds very theoretical until you don't see the detail if you've never had the chance to. But I can assure you, it's really an astonishing. There were hundreds of crusades, and not just aside from the Crusader time, but really every single expedition that happened here in the Near East between the 11th, the 13th century also saw this quite high degree also of entrepreneuriality and once again of strategic vision in a world that in this sense doesn't appear at all as it's exotically distant, right, or misunderstood, right? When we talk about why did the Crusades the Crusader states, at least in the Near East, failed, and the reason is the Europeans had such a different mindset, that they couldn't get they couldn't get along in a way with local communities. They wanted to impose their own feudal Western stuff, and they misunderstood the local environment. And I don't think this is correct. Like, this could be valid actually for any other people, in my opinion. But we like to stress sometimes the cultural clash, right? The idea that here it was about two, hostile, terribly, posed worlds and cultures and beliefs, and that these people couldn't just make it because the world was so divided, and this was such a strong iron arm, right? And all this. No, right? We don't have any evidence of this. If this is true, this was going on literally all over the world, right? And once again, largely far beyond cultural and religious divides that surely didn't help at some levels, but also maybe helped in others, because we have seen countless times how actually, even during the same Crusades, look at what the Byzantines did, openly sabotaging sometimes the Crusaders, sometimes supporting them, other local, for example, Christians actually not liking the Crusaders at all, Muslims actually allying with some Crusaders, and with the same Crusaders actually fighting against each other, the same Muslim fighting against each other, and having plenty of Christians within their armies, and Muslims in Crusader armies. So once again, if one does not accept this concept, as simple as it is, because really there is not much to convince you about. This is like the elementary history of the Crusades. Just if you study it from an evidential point of view, you're going to get there. That I really don't know why we really need sometimes to go back in time so harshly or so ideologically driven, right? In a world that actually was pretty controversial on its own already, but at the time, with or without crusades or jihads, right? And this is not to diminish, for example, the fact that with Islamic invasions, of course, it was a massive wave that came to threaten great part in incorporating, actually conquering great parts of, I say incorporating parts of Christianity, I mean, because of course Christians remained under Muslim rule, and sometimes were treated much better together with the Jews than other, for example, Islamic, let's call them sects. Let's put it in this way, and so once again. There is an important dimension, even as a reaction. Were the Crusades a reaction to Islamic invasions? Well, yeah, why not, right? Overall, the Crusading horizon is founded on the idea that was developed also before the First Crusades, for example, in Spain, but even in southern Italy, that, of course, the Christian world as such had to expand. This perspective is interesting because, you see, the Christians largely didn't even understand what Islam was, right? The Christians thought that these, were kind of heathens because they were either heretics or they had misinterpreted in any way the Christian message. They didn't fully understand the fact that Islam, for example, as we often say, even in the 14th century, Dante, one of the most overwhelmingly cultured people in medieval times, thought that Muhammad was essentially a schismatic Christian bishop, right? So, and the point about the Crusades, I would argue, is that in fact the Christians didn't even care about this, right? Let's leave aside the fact that the crusading expansionism had a very few to do with the concept of forced conversion, for example, or the idea, in fact, of dogmatic corrections, right? The Roman Catholics were much more interested in that regard about imposing Catholicism over the Orthodox Church in the East, and this greater reunion of East and West in this imperialistic and universalistic and, in this sense, merely Christian vision. They didn't care much about the Muslims per se, right? Of course, they hated their guts as much as the Muslims hated their own when they confronted on their fields. There are some beautiful passages of literature that exemplify this, and this antagonism was real. But aside from the cultural points of contacts, including the one with Turkish chivalry and even Arabic and Islamic in general chivalry that was already present in Spain, and also which Christian chivalry took a bit from, but not just a bit. And, the broader idea is that, I can't hate everybody's guts as long as I have the right interest to take these guys out and come to rule in their stead, right? So I think all the times I address the First Crusade, I address these topics because I think they are more important than the history of the Crusade. When you Google something, when I prepared this video, sometimes it happened, maybe at this point not so much, but that I wanted to check certain stuff about a topic, chiefly for finding pictures, because the main problem is that there's not much visual interest even in getting, and don't think that this is not a measure even of for testing what popular culture actually understands or thinks or is engaged or in such topics, right? But you write, I'm making just a banal example, Crusades facts, right? This thing of the fact. Every time you Google an historical topic, there is someone with that corresponds like an immediate result to an amount of people who searched for facts about the this hunger, or thirst for facts, from hard facts, because you must understand that number, that fact, and then you can't go out there talking about this stuff. This is not what history is really about, right? What are facts, right? We largely, essentially interpret sources that are in turn interpreting their own reality. Facts are very often just, either, in fact, basic events, like, I don't know, Jerusalem was captured in 1099, right? Or, certain syntheses produced by certain particular influent scholars that are not even necessarily, so neutrally driven sometimes in every field, by the way, and in every culture, to give a, in fact, an objective reading of the thing that tell you, okay, yeah, this definition is this one. Like those things, like the Vikings were more impacting than the Roman Empire. It was this thing that some jerk comes out with, and then everybody repeats just because he has a PhD, right? And I'm currently working for having one right now, so I can't say that, right? Don't think that this has a certified title is necessarily competent about everything about the topic, or especially its framing, or its so its interpretation, right? Because it's very, very easy, especially for those topics for which people don't read much, and probably they have never had, or they will never will, because it doesn't seem to me that we're going ahead in times in which historical education will be particularly improved, right? We can definitely, surely historiography has improved dramatically, but the approach of the masses towards history, I don't think is very, very healthy at all. It's taking an ever more ideological turn, which I don't like, definitely with all myself, and that is exactly the problem we're having here, right? That in order to express a judgment on a historical event, at least you should have studied all the sources, ideally, and of course nobody can without not even being a PhD, actually. So you say, why are you talking about this stuff now? Well, and why are you judgmental about it? Well, you see, I can be wrong, first of all, but secondly, I think that when you don't concentrate specifically on one topic to, let's say, pretend it's the only one that exists, you tend to realize that, yes, the thing is both more complicated but also more relative than it seems, and this is valid for whole history, right? That's why before I was saying don't concentrate on the niche of, okay, now I know people, frankly, that especially I would say the Middle Ages is maybe not exactly the era in which this happens the most, but let's say compared to the ancient world, this is more likely to see. You see, in the ancient world, we essentially know the most about the Greeks and the Romans. And it's normal to study more the Greeks and the Romans, because basically everything we have, almost basically everything we have, is being produced by them. And also, almost what we know about other peoples is because Greeks and Romans wrote about them. So there's really nothing wrong of dedicating your entire ancient studies to just maybe largely Rome, which is already an infinite universe on its own, than maybe another peripheral people about which we know something just because the Romans wrote. The Middle Ages are very, 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 very different, right? The Middle Ages are a moment in which, first of all, there is an astonishing amount of sources produced, much more than in the ancient world, of course. Secondly, it lacks a real, a dominating, let's say, protagonist. Let's put it in this way. Like, we lack the central empire, or the universal empire that produces everything, interprets everything, right? And therefore, every if you look at the political fragmentation of medieval times, you see that naturally every place started producing stuff on their own. Many people start learning about the history of their own country, fundamentally in the Middle Ages, because before, take countries like, I don't know, Ireland, right? It's not that we know much more about nothing about Ireland from early medieval times only onwards, right? That's when we start talking about something more constant. Even just historiographically speaking, you realize, and this is something astonishing, because actually I think about ancient Ireland there would be a lot of things to say, and I don't see even an attention, right? And this is a very good example, because it also makes you understand how certain national historiographies didn't even, they were carried away probably by either following the trail of some larger ones, read, the English one in that case, and taste as we'd all attached, right? Why is, for example, modern society obsessed about Vikings, right? Because they had, guess what, an incredible echo in English historiography, and therefore now we get to learn about them more than we know about, I don't know, the Lithuanians or the Slavs or other people that on average in the world, aside from their relative national historiographies, nobody really seemed to be particularly over knowledgeable about. But what happens in the Middle Ages, which is kind of very weird, is that you find many history fans that start studying stuff just with a monomaniacal focus, right? It's like, I don't know, the other day I found out with some surprise that people were obsessed about the Normans as such, right? There is probably a trail of Vikings in that regard, and I love the Normans. Like, I love... we actually didn't make many videos about them, but let's say I have all the interest and the intention, of course, of talking about them extensively here. But you find people that basically study exclusively Norman history. And this exclusively means very often also crossing out what doesn't fit maybe with certain ideological reasons that push these people to learn about the Normans. I found people who were obsessed about the Normans, for example, that had literally, and this is kind of never heard of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, for example. That is not just to say, you see, maybe these people came from, I don't know where they may learn from. They studied mostly about the Anglo-Normans or maybe the end of the Viking era, or the beginning of the 10th century. But if you literally, because I found these people never heard of, I'm very very serious in here, of the Kingdom of Sicily, what actually do you know about the Middle Ages? Because this is the serious problem we have here. Today we will see, like next time, that actually the Normans in this regard were protagonists of the First Crusade, because if you look at Robert, Duke of Normandy, but also Bohemond of Hauteville from the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, created their own possessions in the Outremer. But the question is, why do you focus on a people, and aside from crossing out a major chunk of their offspring in that sense, that accomplished an astonishing lot, because the Norman Kingdom of Sicily was the single most centralized Latin Germanic political entity that ever existed in high medieval Europe, right? And had an astonishing political, military, juridical capacity. I mean, it was administratively very developed, etc. The question is, why do you focus exclusively on the Normans, right? What are the reasons that bring a person to, get this beautifully medieval topic and pretending that the attention ends there, right? Is it because you don't have enough money to buy other books? I don't think so, because no, we can learn about stuff literally for free everywhere. Is it because you have maybe some nationalistic reason, or you want to and this is just to answer, in fact, a comment I got another day from Facebook groups when I share this stuff that I don't respond to, because most of the time it's kind of ridiculous comments, and other times simply because they're stupid comments. So I'm sorry for that. But for example, there is this perspective that made me think, actually, so it was not entirely useless, but about considering the First Crusade as essentially a Norman conquest. You see, at this point I could still teach kids in high school history, right? And hopefully in some month even make exams at university for those students that arrive. And my point is that if you come to me and you tell me that the First Crusade was actually a persecution of the Norman conquests, pretending that it was just a Norman conquest, right? That is, that there weren't, for example, the Lorrainese, Flemish, and Germans of Godefroy Bouillon, for example, or the Occitanes of Raymond Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse. Well, chances are that you will not pass my examination, right? Because the question is, why do you have to stress that? Okay, Robert, Duke of Normandy, was son of William the Conqueror. Bohemond and Tancred of Hauteville were, of course, respectively son and nephew of Robert the Guiscard, that had conquered Muslim Sicily. But the question is, why do you have to stress the fact that this was just a Norman invasion? Do you want to absolutize the role of the Normans in this case? Do you want... I met another guy who was completely crazy about it, that was obsessed about the Normans exclusively, and complained, I remember once, about the fact that I had titled my one video about, I don't remember what it was about, but whatever. It included in the title the Sultanate of Rome, right? And so you know what we're talking about. And the criticism, very subtle and very kind of stingy and sarcastic, but not even attacking me personally, but this kind of conspiratorial slash, as I will see now, and even how to define it, mindset of saying that basically we shouldn't use the term, because the question was, what is the Sultanate of Rome? And I said, and I immediately linked the Wikipedia, term to just banalize his question, to say, look it up if you really don't know, otherwise, are you kidding me? And the answer was something like, it's wrong and it's bad, and there are the usual ideological reasons for mixing an English name with an Arab one. This should have been the Sultanate of Rome. And by the way, Wikipedia sucks, right? The question is, of course I didn't answer, because the guy was just one of these skinny, I don't know even to define them, people who were obsessed just about Viking stuff. They cut their hair the Viking style, and literally wrote everything about exclusively on that site, on that group. I remember, because there's the simple search on the group contents, exclusively about the Normans, and I'm obsessed about that. We complained because that was not the official name, or it was not the correct one, etc. And by the way, he was the same guy who was using the term Byzantine in the group. You're complaining on the historicity of a content, and you call, because Sultanate of Rome, according to you, is not correct. You said Byzantine, while it was actually the Roman Empire. You also use the term Byzantine, have any problem, but here you have double standards of some sort. And the question, when I see these things, is, the implication, of course, is that there was this kind of, probably in his mind, leftist mentality that had to mix English and Arab names for political reasons of wanting to blend, Westerners with Muslims and that stuff. You see, when you meet these people, you don't really know what to... I didn't respond because I thought it was too stupid. But the question is, why are there these people, right? What does bring a person to be so ideologically fanatic and, let's say, but it's not even about the fanatism in itself and the ridiculousness of the wall, of the figure, of the person, of the statement, but, how can you get triggered by something like, okay, right, the Sultanate of Rome, like the entire English historiography does. I don't know when since, because this is something that dates back as easily... I've seen books from the 1950s still using this. We still use it right away. And by the way, it's also fascinating, my opinion, because if it had been the Sultanate of Rome, I would... a Sultanate of Rome, I would say, well, what the hell is Sultanate of Rome? And actually, as a Western ear, would disturb me to say, Rome cannot be a Sultanate. Instead, I find fascinating and kind of exotic and picturesque to say the Sultanate of Rome, to stress actually the fact that within the Arab culture was the idea of the Roman Empire as actually the universal empire, or at least something that was parallel in this sense from the other side to the Islamic Caliphate, was interiorized, right? It was taken as a model of political, institutional, juridical leadership, if you want, and that bore its name. Naturally, there are many other reasons, also because the fact that Rome was the area of Rome, like for the Turks and other peoples that had settled after massacre to take those lands, and the concept also of definitely that was the westernmost Islamic power in that regard, and that Anatolia always had this kind of very ambiguous nature and character at the fringes of the Islamic were the same. I mean, places like Iraq or Syria or Egypt. So Anatolia, like the land of the heretics, a bit like the Maghreb, a bit like, where all this in the mountains, right? And also in this less kind of, in fact, urbanized, sophisticated areas far away from the capitals of the caliphates, because there were more than one, at least each one thought to be the only one. But I don't know. And the obvious answer in there is that there's not just a political ideology, and I don't care what people think as long as they don't bother me personally, directly. But the point is, why do you have to misuse history in this regard? I mean, the obvious answer from that person is that I'm misusing history because I'm mixing English and Arab names for ideological reasons, right? It's like, as you know, I'm at all not dogmatic on historical names and definitions. I use interchangeably Byzantine Empire, Roman Empire, and by the way, it's also pretty silly to be kind of grammar Nazi or historical Nazi about names and definitions, because there's no single language in the world that doesn't actually change the name of peoples and countries in their own way. So if you're really obsessed and phobic about these things, why don't you start by changing your own language and starting to call the the Germans the Deutsche, or instead of the les Allemands, right, in French, because guess what, languages evolve and change, and if people start to use a certain terminology, as long as it doesn't literally mean something else. So here the field of etymologies and semantics is quite tricky one, because also for other extremistic on the complete other side of the political spectrum, there is also this idea that now everything has to be changed in sense of meaning. I'm actually for etymological sense. I mean, if a word means something in the original language, more or less we can agree how to use it in a rational and non-twistable way. But if I call a name like the Sultanate of Rome, that is literally the same thing, because Rome in Arab means Rome, right? And Sultanate is I don't know in Arab, how is it, Sultanate, something like that. What's the deal, right? Are you dumb, right? I have problems with people who reason like this, because because you understand there is an obsession behind it. If that person had questioned it just freely and non-picked and non-complex, it would have been different. But every once in a while you meet these people, and frankly, I don't know why I'm turning this video into this, so maybe we can just discuss about that without repeating the usual story of the First Crusade. But there are certain important things that we have to tell anyway, it also happens, I must say. You see, I share, as probably many of you know, because you come from those groups, in some part, that I share on many Facebook groups, these things. And I must say that the most interacting and also the most, in fact, ideologically and somewhat aggressive minded groups I find are exactly the ones dedicated to the Crusades. But it's not because it has nothing to do with the fact that with religion, right? It's not because these people are Christian or they're not Christian. I don't know, because it doesn't even seem to me, frankly. As you know, in my videos overall, I have, first of all, by standard, by myself, a Western perspective, because I live in mostly Christian country, and I it has been central even for the Crusades overall, and I don't I don't think I could have a very different view in this regard. I'm also I largely, aside from my beliefs, whichever they are, I have a positive view of religions in general, but in contextualized in their in fact environment and how they developed and why and what they mean and etc. And I make a lot of religious history videos as well that and I presume that you follow me also for this reason, are not at all ideological, propagandistic. Like I try to, as a medievalist, to tell the story of Christianity, of Islam, in the way we teach them in the academies, right? Without any necessity of being religious or not. I have I must say, most of my colleagues are fellow medievalists are Christian, but and possibly there is a reason, right? There is a link, but I also have atheist colleagues that study the Middle Ages as well, and of course, like Christianity, medieval Christianity, get passionate about it, that study, the research about them, because guess what? If you cross out religion from history, I mean, you basically cross out all of history, because all of history is being influenced by religion. So it doesn't even matter how much it actually influenced it, in quantitatively speaking, because it's mixed, it's fused with it in the first place. And also, I must say, I was saying this to say that I mostly have a Western perspective. I mostly tell, the Christian side of the story, also because I know less about the Muslims. But I get I must say, pleasing appreciation more often by Muslim followers. They say, you know what, this idea is kind of interesting, right? Thanks for talking about it. And I tell them thanks to you, because I think this is how we should talk in these terms, right? Here it has literally nothing to do with pretending that Christians were better or worse, the Muslims were better or worse. This is telling the story. And that's why I like this, because it seems to me that every time we talk about the Crusades, we must apologize for doing it. We must apologize in the sense of even apologizing for presenting the topic, or at least making certain premises. And yeah, that's literally what I'm doing actually right now, but also stressing the fact that there is a reason why we should do them, that is to hopefully free the other people from this need of apologizing for talking about it. Because if we have to start apologizing just by talking of history, we can't make any history, because the next step is you can't talk about history, and that's a dictatorship. And hell, I would never live in a dictatorship. It's better if you kill me. And also because I would probably try to kill you in the process. But aside from that, this is a perspective that to me matters, right? And in fact, just to come back to the point of the Normans, which I repeat, I love, and we will make plenty of videos about them, I promise you. We still haven't done it. Random chance why it didn't happen. But no, you can't say that the first crusade was a Norman conquest, right? Because the word Normans within these people that were not even another mistake we often make about the Normans is pretending that they were a people, right? The ethnicistic obsession brings to the idea that the Normans here were like always the Vikings, right? But now they had transformed into French, but they were still Normans, right? They were the same descendants. They had the same genes. Well, actually, no, because Norman is a synecdoche at this time. The Norman army that invaded England in 1066 was, of course, Norman, which means Vikings plus a lot of actually Western Frankish people. And I mean, if you were to split a genetic cross-section, and that's also just an approximation, because war Normans were Western Frankish people, right? You should go back to see that. But also Flemish, right? Brittonic people, right? And others who conquered southern Italy and Sicily, according to you, where the Normans, like, these were pure Danes that had just, passed by France and then went there. Of course, there were people descending from the Jutland, from Scandinavia, but there were lots of people coming literally from everywhere. I mean, the Normans who conquered Sicily were largely, what we'd call Western Frankish, even Occitans, even Germans. I mean, even the same Italians, right? And possibly even some other Muslim, because guess what? Someone was there as well, and they joined the same Normans. Because guess what? This is what happens in every single place you see at that time, right? So it's complicated sometimes to address these topics because of prejudices, because otherwise it wouldn't be. Like, the whole picture is very simple. I'm not explaining you anything that I presume most of you actually already know these things, right? And I hope so, at least. And I, generally speaking, see that you're appreciative. You realize that this stuff has its own importance. So I think we're okay with that. But the point here I would like to make is also another word about the Poor's Crusade, which is one of those events that make weird things getting weirder. Because, as you know, as soon as the Pope's call went off, the Pope, as we have seen in the last video, was reasoning a completely different plan. Right, the Pope didn't care about the mass mobilization of Christianity for the Near East, for the Holy Land. The Pope wanted those, good, several hundred knights to send to conquer something out there. Right, this was the papal mindset, because guess what? The papacy was one of the most dramatically, intellectually developed power of that time, was into the mid of the whole international politics between West and East, and understood exactly what it took to go there to take the Holy Land. That is not a bunch of beggars to, without even a logistical train that goes raiding and pillaging on the same Christian land across half of Europe, right? It requires a solid and contained and manageable amount of military professionals to go out there to achieve this astonishing thing that also is, presents a lot of vision. And as we were saying before, there is this tendency of saying, oh, well, these were dreamers. It was kind of also this prejudice that the Crusade was a kind of an irrational thing, that this is what the Enlightenment invented, like the fact that now the West was carried away by religious fanatism and did this, and through violence and irrationality and beast-like behavior conquered the Eastern world as barbarians and stuff. There was a most refined concept of what this expedition could be, right? But then there is collateral damage, and this collateral damage came in the form of this Poor's Crusade, right? So-called. And as you understand, I don't have many sympathy for the fringe of the masses. I believe that when you search for violence and intolerance and radicalism and uncompromising behavior, you have to look at the dispossessed of the desperate masses that objectively have their own valid maybe not, but that definitely there are reasons for achieving that level of disruptiveness, right? I have a great faith in humanity overall, and most of this passes through the hierarchies of it, because hierarchies are something built with rationality and that is necessary, coming out from the needs of real organization, right? that in this sense model and bend and shape this even radical forms that the same hierarchy of course can take sometimes. And if you look at the excess here, that is the extremes. From one side there is the papacy, that is the highest hierarchy at least in a spiritual field. In the other there is the lowest, dispossessed masses, right, of these Christians, of these Roman Catholics that were not by the way all the same. Of course, here we're talking about Europe overall. Europe, as we were saying last time, this point is there are regions that are barely Christianized, right? I wouldn't be surprised if some pagan actually even joined the Crusades. This is a perspective you never hear, but do you think that among, I don't know, I don't remember how the guy was called, but among Danish or Norwegian so-called Crusaders, there weren't pagans in 1096, right? Because to me it's pretty obvious that there were, and then there were different stages of development, right? There are dispossessed masses that come from the oppression of feudal society. There are dispossessed masses sometimes, the ones that gathered in the rising cities. There are sometimes just mortiers and brigands and other figures that just join the group because they know that wherever this mass passes, it kind of overwhelms the local defenses, the local authorities, and you can sack and pillage and rob and rape and whatever. This happened, right? From spring of 1096, this rabble of people that in part naturally was well driven, right? There were people who truly believed in this whole enterprise, were pious. There were actually women, children. There were pious people, individuals, people coming from all the strata of the population, actually, not just the dispossessed, but largely the poorest crusade. I mean, it's called in this way for a reason. They were inflamed by the word of these itinerant and charismatic preachers, among which definitely most important, as it's famous, is Pierre of Amiens, known as Peter the Hermit, who would actually survive the massacre of the same expedition in Anatolia by the hands of the Turks. There were dispossessed noblemen like Gautier sans savoir. The nobility always had this kind of directing role in society of the time. All these great, even peasant expansion, agriculture, was all driven properly by the nobility. There would have been no even communal development if the agricultural explosion literally from the 10th to the 11th century would have not been created by the nobility, right, in its capitals, in its rational organization, etc. But this dispossessed noblemen were also a problem. Last video we didn't talk specifically about that. This was another question that was made me observe, and that I agree with, of course. But even that comment, for example, was seen in a dogmatic way. Like, there's one guy who thinks now that the only reason worth mentioning, and possibly the only reason why, according to I didn't ask either, by the Crusades happened was just to get rid of the cadet sons of the nobility that went around, in fact, doing pretty nasty stuff all over the Christendom. And this is kind of a reason, but let's not confuse it with, do you think that Crusade was done by that? I mean, don't you take into account the reforming papacy? Don't you take account the traffics that were being revived in Mediterranean? Don't you take into account even the actual international quest that Alexis Komnenos made for Western mercenaries in the East? I mean, you can't explain the Crusade with one thing. I mean, because each and every one of these reasons that appear to be, important, at least as much as that one, in fact, were altogether more important than a single one. In fact, possibly also without the reforming papacy by itself, for example, the Crusades might have not happened, or at least not in that way, right? So the fact, do you think that, how do you think that these people were also effectively channeled in the Crusades, right? These hot-headed young males that went around pillaging and raping and exterminating on a regular basis, to be all of a sudden channeled in Crusade, and yeah, they went out of there just venting themselves. I mean, if you have a basic knowledge of, European policy at this time, you know that the Westerners kept fighting against themselves all along, right? So I really don't get it. But there were, right, this possessed noblemen that saw this opportunity to make profit. Why would you think they would, right? It's often underestimated, the entrepreneurial mindset of the feudal world. The feudal world was not barter and closed economy and all this garbage that fortunately we have surpassed historiographically from 2 or 3 generations. The feudal system was a dramatically dynamic and economical thing, and as we were saying before, it also was largely the engine of European economy at this point, especially of Central Europe, right? It's pretty clear. So what I wanted to point out mostly about the Crusaders, the Poor's Crusade, is this disgusting chapter of our history, in which, by traveling towards the Holy Land across the Rhine and Danube valleys, these people began, so these allegedly poor, angelic creatures, devoted, right, to, and not last the brute knights who were just a bunch of evil people. No, this rabble of criminals actually began the hunt to the infidels and their massacre, which means basically that, guess what is the only person who is not Christian in Europe at this time? The Jews, right? It was the Jewish communities that suffered incredibly undescribable massacres in this time, and especially in Germany. This was the area where it happened, and the Jews being accused, of course, of the persecution of Christ, as you can imagine, etc. But these are the darkest chapters of the Crusades, of a movement in here that you can't even identify per se, because nobody had told to these people to move, or even just to kill the Jews. Another thing, we made a video on actually medieval Jews, and another picture we often get is the fact that the ecclesiastical elites were fundamentally persecutory towards the Jews. Absolutely false. The Jews in this time were saved by this kind of waves of violent fanatism that are proper, let's remember this, of stupid, ignorant people, right, of the lowest scum of society, because anti-Semitism is a declaration of intellectual inexistence, right, of indignity and of radical mental inferiority, and it's one of the darkest and most and unforgivable characters of a society, right, were actually defended, right, from these fanatics by the ecclesiastical elites, right? The papacy, of course, discriminated the Jews. The Jews were discriminated against by the church, by all the church, not just the Roman Catholic ones, but discrimination in this regard went in parallel with the forbidding persecution, right? Once the Jews left, this something, the ghettos were created later on mostly. At this point, Jews were, fairly free for those, conditions, standards in Europe. Then eventually it would be increasingly, in fact, ghettoized. But ghettoization went in parallel with the fact that you couldn't do any harm to them, right? There were certain specific taxes. Naturally, they were mocked, but these radical violences were always opposed by the very ecclesiastical elites. The same anti-Jewish pogroms that broke out during the Black Death in mid-14th century were carried out. There are very interesting studies on this, mostly for economical reasons, right? The poorest Jews were discriminated against, but there is an evidence that actually the local Christian communities just wanted to steal the Jewish money when this was present, right? Which also proves, by the way, not all Jews were rich or kind of doing like the prejudice, of course, that stems from those times, right? That is still present in anti-Semitism, and it was figures like the local bishops that actually took very energetic measures against these idiots that in the process not just killed Jews and and robbed their properties, but also made a mess, because of course these people would have even defended themselves, and they lived within the same cities. So this was something that would disrupt even the entire community as such, even create an economical damage, because don't think even in here that the ecclesiastical elites were just driven by love for the Jews. They did it also for more pragmatic reasons, but definitely more civilized ones than this bunch of scum that went on just killing Jews because, in this case, they were the infidels, right? The very interesting stuff, though, about this poor crusade is that they suffered eventually the same, they got repaid for this violence, because they, after having committed these massacres, especially in cities like Worms, Mainz. In Mainz, they as much as 1,000 Jews were killed, and just to make you understand, those were not times in which demographics was so developed. So in order to kill 1,000 Jews, it's a bath of blood in an entire community. It's something inenarrable. Also in Cologne, Trier, Metz, Prague, right? So all this Central European area. But these beasts got repaid, right? Because after these robberies, raids, and killings, they alarmed the Danubian communities that they were actually, of those territories where they would have gone to pass. And in fact, in Hungary, they they were defeated, right? They were massacred in their place, right? So well-deserved punishment for a bunch of anti-Semitic scum. And the survivors, however, because of course they weren't all killers in this sense, or criminals, but they prosecuted towards Constantinople, and they went to Anatolia, where eventually they were massacred by the Seljuks. So that's how it went. Pierre of Amiens actually survived, because he had left the expedition just before the Turks would massacre it, and in fact Pierre of Amiens actually assisted to the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. So we have listed last time already the components of the Crusader expedition, of the one, let's say, of the official one, the one of the knights, right? The one of these military professionals that actually showed an astonishing logistical capability in this sense. Also considering that they were all separated, there was not a real chief of the expedition. The European nobility was competing among each other. There was no king, no emperor in this one, and because they were either excommunicated or busy somewhere else, and therefore they were all kind of vassals of some, of course, even very high. There was, for example, the brother of the French king. There was, but they were all separated. Right, there were three main chunks fundamentally, and they were all ruled by peers. Of course, we remember Hugues of Vermandois, who was brother of the French king, as we were saying, Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lorraine, with the Walloons and part of the Germans, Then Robert, Duke of Normandy, who was son of William the Conqueror himself, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, Bohemond, and Tancred of Hauteville. They were respectively son and nephew of Robert Guiscard, as we were saying before, and they were under the watch, let's say, the guide, spiritual guide of the papal legate Adhemar of Montreuil. Right, so you see that it's mostly essentially French-dominated enterprise, like the Outremer Crusades would largely be. And they received, this expedition went mostly by land, but when they arrived in the Near East, they started besieging coastal centers, etc. They received the important support of the peasants and of the Genoese, right, that were in places like Syria and Egypt, and Egypt chiefly Venice, but since centuries at this point, and they had the naval power that this other Central European, essentially terrestrial power didn't have, right? So the Italians were of dramatic logistical help for the Crusades. There were nuclei actually of, as we were saying before, even Northern Europeans, maritime forces that also enjoyed some success, and that can be interpreted as a sort of, tailstroke of the Viking era, after all, because, don't think that things changed that much. Actually, there is all a beautiful branch of Scandinavian history in this period that shows you how the Leidang and the naval expeditions of the Scandinavian kingdoms actually was turned into naturally in a more monarchic, more disciplined, centralized apparatus over time, indirected actually towards the pagans at this point, in the Baltic chiefly, but there are actually Scandinavian expeditions also to the Near East. And here we are at the end of the 11th century. I mean, what difference do you want? There is no difference between them or the Harald or Drada that was fighting for the Byzantines all over the Mediterranean a few tens of years before. The Italian support was dramatically important also because the Italians had interest in seizing the various coastal towns of Syria and Palestine. There were colonies, these funduks, this sort of warehouses eventually turning into major arsenals and depots that the Italian republics established directly and having their cities prospering with this trade centers in the conquered regions. Concerning the route, the single military contingents gathered in Constantinople, some by sea, especially the ones from Sicily, the others largely through the Balkans, with great difficulties as well, right? They had problems along the way. These populations, especially the Bulgarians, weren't very happy of the passage of these people. The same Byzantines actually freaked out when they saw how many the Crusaders were, and also because they didn't expect it, right? They thought, they knew, actually this could happen, but they wouldn't imagine it would in that dimension, because they had never conceived the idea of the Crusade as such, right? It was completely extraneous to Byzantine mentality that a bishop, read the Pope, could tell secular princes how to use their troops and to basically create this army out of the blue and to pass for Constantinople. As we repeated last time, actually the Hauteville, the Siculo-Normans, were actually had been invading the Byzantine Empire in Epirus, and in a few decades they would even capture briefly Thessalonica. And they were heading at Constantinople. So just imagine if these people had fought a few tens of years before, in 81, with the Byzantines, what feelings could there be there? So, of course, the Byzantines were quite happy to make them dislodge initially actually negotiating with them for, arranging the distribution of property when this new lands would have been created, because of course the Byzantines thought that Syria and Palestine were part of the Roman Empire, and that the Crusaders were there just to conquer it and giving them back to Constantinople. Of course, it didn't go that way. But the relations were very ambiguous among each other all the way through this, and the Byzantines actually even sabotaged openly the Crusaders, even showing every once in a while they sent help, but not really more than much. And the Crusade moved towards the Holy Land in 1097. And of course the Byzantines had promised also supplies, etc. And this thing instead would be a great problem. There were actually even different branches, different routes the Crusaders took. Some were even basically stopped by the Turks along the way. This would happen again during the Second Crusade. But the main bulk went on, and it fundamentally managed to crush the Seljuk opposition. In the last video we talked about this, the Battle of Deryllium, also some essentially military elements. Today we skipped them because we already talked about them. Military aspect, let's say, of the Crusade, this fact of the Turkish horse archery, the broader political fragmentation of Islam, etc. So skipping to 1099, Jerusalem was conquered, becoming the capital of the homonymous kingdom. And as you know, the sack of Jerusalem is an infamous event in which the Crusaders basically exterminated great part of the Islamic and Jewish population, but also the Christians in part. And this is also controversial to explain. We tried to attempt it last time without sounding too cruel, but I mean the idea of a city existing against the besiegers, and considering that the population had actually helped the Seljuks to help the Christians out, right? And because guess what? These were foreigners. They were coming out of nowhere. They just wanted the city. They would have sacked it anyway. So this equated to say, okay, you opposed resistance. That's what you get. It was normal at the time. I mean, not normal in the sense that we can say that it was done all the time, or that people didn't care about butchering their fellow men, right? Actually, the same Christian sources talk quite openly about these massacres, and even stressing how ferocious it was. Well, if an 11th century Western world was able to basically tell the story not by being elated by it, if not by the conquest of the holy city, but actually saddened by the massacre and this nonsensical violence by certain standards, you can see how already morally advanced this world was, right? You make the Crusade, you accomplish this incredible achievement that was also quite lucky in many ways. You get Jerusalem in one shot. Enormous success of the Roman Church, enormous success of Christianity. You could transform this in, we did, everything was nice, let's conceal the fact that we massacred people. Instead, no, these people said, this horrible thing was done. And that's very mature, actually. This is a kind of sensitivity that you don't find, for example, in the ancient world. I mean, in the ancient world, they find people blaming others for killing each other, but, from the other side, you say, yeah, okay, but it was fine to kill them anyway, because there were a bunch, I don't know, either rebels, or, it's not the first time Westerners actually destroyed Jerusalem. Look at the Romans. But the point here is that we must also contextualize, in fact, what the military usages of the time were. And it's not that the Crusaders did worse than what others did. Of course, when the Muslims took Jerusalem later on, 1 century afterward, this thing didn't happen. So that's a significant different, but also the context was different. And I would say that we also don't really know how things went, right? In the sense, okay, the massacre did exist, but what brought to it on the long run was it just cruelty? Of course, in part, maybe even in great part, but other armies all over the world did the same. So even once again pointed that as, look at what Crusaders were because they were bad, like it was a bunch of fanatic Christians, but it's not really a great historical assessment, right? Because you can't give context to a practice at the time was really the normality, and it was even blamed by the same Christian sources. So, but this is not to justify it in any way, of course. So, in the last video, we substantially explained the establishment of the Outremer states. Godfrey of Bouillon, that was the head of the expedition in the siege of Jerusalem, was crowned, let's say, with the title of Advocatus, so the defender, the called one, to the Holy Sepulchre, right? And he refused himself to, as he said, allegedly, to wear a crown of gold when our Lord had worn a crown of thorns. Eventually, their successors obtained the titles of kings proper. After his death in 1100, he was succeeded by his brother Baldwin, that was Count of Edessa, that assumed the title of king, in fact, and proceeded to widen the control of the coastal areas and to consolidate more generally the structures of the kingdom. This part is very important because we explained last time that after all, this territory was a fairly good one, right? I find disgusting when people think, I don't know, that Palestine is desert, right? That there is this stupid cliche some people have in the West, objectively, that whatever is Eastern Asian stuff, Muslim, it's desert. No, right? Aside from the fact that these are some lands which there are some of the most diverse lands and terrains, climates, etc. But of course, Palestine, Syria were some fertile and populated areas in the Mediterranean, just like Egypt. There of course is more, but overall these are rich, developed areas, and they weren't at all like a wasteland, right? The states that were formed at this point were together with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principate of Antioch, that was governed by the Hauteville, the County of Edessa, that was the only one that didn't have access to the sea. It was mostly, and kind of also more frontier-like, militarized against the Muslims of Syria. In fact, the one that would fall kind of the quickest. And the local government was organized in a vassalitic form, right? The lords had ensured this at the end of the Crusade, this dominions and important rents locally. And many people, this is another thing that is expressed like, this was a form of European colonialism. This is another thing I completely disagree with, right? European colonialism is something specific from the modern age that could count on a much greater functionalization of the exploitative means through, a great asymmetry in the relations, especially naval, also technological capacities, with a specific intensive exploitation of local resources, a structural employment of slavery, also a broader connection with the emerging statal infrastructures, the centralization of trade from the side of the cities. So it's something very different that doesn't fit here by the slightest, right? Here, colonialism is also something that, you must be someone's colony. What were the Crusader states colonies of exactly? They were actually kingdoms on their own. Think about the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Can you call it a colony? It was a kingdom on its own, with its own basis. They even managed to actually get away from the papal control after the conquest. The same goes for Antioch. That was, maybe Antioch was more connected to the Kingdom of Sicily, but, when we look at other events in the Mediterranean, that these were kind of different, separate chunks. It's like even later times, think about, the Aragonese conquest of Sicily, right? The Aragonese conquered Sicily in the 1300, and can you talk about Aragonese colonialism of Sicily? These were basically two separated kingdoms that worked basically on their own. They were kept within the same dynastic cradle, let's say, but sometimes they even fought one against the other. So how can you talk about colonialism exactly about this? There is this idea that that is something that was naturally spread historiographically and ideologically and politically speaking because of the obvious fact that the Near East and the Middle East at some point were colonized by the Europeans in the 19th century, and naturally even you see, there is something interesting in the Muslim world, that is the fact that the Crusades didn't leave an actual mark on these people, right? The Muslims, this has been studied widely. I mean, they had they were living a moment of crisis, right? Now we don't have time to digress on it, but the fact that, for example, the same establishment of the Crusader states was allowed by this political fragmentation, right? Even this picture that the Seljuk Turks arrived like a human tide, they conquered everything and they were controlling everything, is so powerful. It's completely false. The Seljuks didn't have any political unity. They were namely part of this dynasty that ruled everywhere. They were intertwined, all these things, but they were all split powers by this point. Actually, even before the First Crusade, their momentum had ceased. And when the Crusaders established in these coastal areas of the Near East, of course the Muslims were pretty suspicious about it, and they immediately began to counter it, but they didn't leave this as a trauma. They said, these are, again, those weird Westerners that come here do weird stuff, like the Byzantines did. Let's fight them, and eventually, one century after Jerusalem had fallen and they had the upper hand, and we know how it ended. Up to the 19th, the 20th century, the Muslim world didn't get triggered about the Crusades. First of all, they had won them, so that was just saying, okay, yeah, those bastards came here, we kicked their ass, right? But, I mean, there had been much more important things from the perspective that had happened, right? Think about the Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion was, the Mongols razed to the ground Baghdad. It was by far one of the single most, some largest and most advanced cities in the world. This went on in other areas in the Muslim world. Think about Merv, the ancient Antiochia in Marjana, I think it's today's Turkmenistan, or that was the largest city in the world. By the 13th century, it is the most populated city in the world. Many people don't even know it exists because think that north of the Anatolian, of the Iranian plateau, there is nothing. Actually, those were some of the most advanced areas of Eurasia up to that point. The Mongols traumatized in an unspeakable way the whole Islamic world. Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was the center of the most advanced art, culture, and science of the Islamic world. It was razed literally to the ground entirely, and that was an issue, right? Even the same Ottoman expansion, right, was a big deal. The Turkish Persian clash. These were things probably, I mean, the Muslims were mostly interested in historiographically speaking. This idea of the Europeans, they're, the fucking colonialists coming exploiting us, is something that actually began, after the 19th century and 20th century. It was fueled also under very different currents. Think about the laicistic, socialistic, pro-Soviet, ideas that were anti-capitalistic, anti-Westerner during the Cold War, right, in the Arab countries. Actually, to speak of European colonialism for the Crusades, to me, is just dumb. And yeah, I know that there are authoritative authors that, speak of this, anecdotally, right? Like saying, okay, this was the first time Europeans went abroad. Why not during Roman times? Weren't the Roman Europeans? They also went conquering, and that was an actual empire. That was an actual imperialism. Yet we can't talk about colonialism there either, right? Even if we're actual colonies in that sense. But even in there, it's kind of like creating colonies in the sense of creating cities to go populate them and to create this labor force of farmers that would eventually Romanize the whole thing, right? Colonialism, like the Europeans did in modern contemporary age, is something very, 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 very different, right? It was largely about exploiting the local resources and, kind of even advance the country in that function, infrastructurally and so on, just for getting more resources more easily. And in part, colonialism even helped certain countries to develop in a way that would have not been possible to. Of course, this cannot erase things like genocide or other all the oppressions, and you can imagine in the process. But you can't talk about colonialism if not in a very non-precise and scientific way for the Crusades. It's kind of ridiculous in my opinion. And people say, well, but there is one specific character about it, that is the fact that the Westerners exploited the local inhabitants. Yes, because what do you think what the nobility was exactly doing in Europe at this time? Do you know how peasants lived? Like what the nobility thought of the peasantry in Europe, right? What do you think that in Europe we thought that everybody was equal and everybody happily Christian? There was as I often define it, actually a proto-racial contempt towards inferior classes, right? The peasants were thought by the feudal and urban elites to be borderline human beings, and they were treated as such. So what the Crusaders did in the Near East was exactly what they did in West. The main criticism you can applicate there is saying, as we were saying in the beginning, the Crusaders thought that Western society was like the local one, and they were mistaken. And this is true. Right, this is true because the Near East, the Islamic world overall, but even the Byzantine one, for example, had grown and was growing actually, even without the Western influence that, however, was very strong, especially after the Crusades. But even in the Byzantine Empire, look at the privatization of power with the pronoia system, etc. But there was a much more equal distribution of property in the Near East, while Western feudalism was characterized by this enormous concentration of wealth in the hands of few people, right? So naturally, this land was very different from northern France, but you can argue that even, northern Italy was very different from northern France, right? So the same reason why, Frederick Barbarossa in the same 12th century was defeated by the Lombard League. They were wrong in that regard, but I don't think we can read it just as a Western dichotomy. It was mostly a feudal dichotomy, if you really want to stress it, but I don't think that's even correct, because after all, the Crusaders managed to consolidate feudal powers in this area, and the reason why they lost eventually can be cannot be read just in a socio-economical sense, like this was a system that failed, right? There was, it was actually pretty similar also to other areas of the world, and even some areas of Europe. And it rather failed because, I don't know, if the Crusaders had won at Hattin, probably it would have not failed. Guess what? This determinism saying, the Crusader states had to fail anyway, right? It's silly. And it's very Western-centric too, because it implies that the Muslims didn't do anything, for example, to fight against the Crusaders. If you look at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin bet an enormous amount of resources from all Syria and Egypt to commit them in one battle, right? And the Crusaders were defeated. But had they won, for example, in another battle, or in that one, which in the video about it, we actually stressed how, yes, the situation was very tough, but the Crusaders didn't go very far from losing that battle, after all. Things could have gone very differently. Think about a Crusader victory at Hattin, right? It would have been, the rule of Egypt and Syria would have been shaken. The Crusaders would have passed to the counteroffensive. There would have been a further investment in conquest. But for not talking even about things, even when the Crusaders were, for example, when the Crusade of Louis IX, the second, when he instead died in Tunis with the plague. Do you think he could easily, if you look at the numbers of that expedition, could easily conquer Egypt? It was not like the first expedition. Once you took Egypt, was open, everything was open. Jerusalem would have been reconquered. Syria would have been saved. Things could go radically different, and you cannot interpret Crusader history deterministically by saying, no, it was doomed to fail, to fall. We're not made for it, right? This is, in my opinion, a mentality that emerged from, even from, I would say, from 20th century Western defeatism in relation to colonialism and the Vietnam War, the war in Algeria, and all this stuff. This idea that you can't deal with those countries, man, because they're different, and you can't impose your culture on them, and you can't rule them because they will start guerrilla. You can't defeat guerrilla, right? And this is the usual garbage you often hear around, right? As if first of all, the French weren't winning actually on the ground in Algeria, or the Americans, were sacking in Vietnam, or things like that. Let's learn the fact that there is something called politics that has to do more with what was happening respectively in France at the time and the United States respectively, than what was actually happening on the field in those other countries. This idea that the West is in repeating this impression for the Crusade, right? As it happened, when the Crusaders lost Syria at the end of the 13th century, licking their wounds and starting thinking, these Muslims, after all, they're even people you can cope with in some way, or at least there's a diplomacy you can use. You can use it in the distance. There is no need to invade them. These were things that were actually thought and produced easily. We can easily see it in 14th century literature, right? In 14th century literature, there were some Christian jurists that went as far as saying that, after all, the Muslims were even, legally right in having some of their lands, right? And this is more than stressing the unavoidable, I don't know how to say it, the inescapable, let's put it in this way, unavoidable, this is what I wanted to say, loss of the Near East. It rather says, how deep, once again, Western culture already was at that time to conceptualize that and to start thinking even of bigger plans, like trying to Christianize the Mongols to eventually crush the Muslims from both sides. So this is still what pushed Columbus to reach what he thought it was, in fact, China or Japan in America, to reunite. I mean, to talk with the Mongols that didn't exist from 150 years as a dynasty in China, to crush together Islam from both sides of the globe. Right, this was the mentality. And it's actually very interesting, and I would like to know more, telling the truth, about even the Muslim perspective at the same time, or even if it's possible about the Chinese perspective. But I don't think there is, and I think the West in this regard was unique on its own. So, what I was trying to say overall about the Crusader rule in the Near East is that actually wasn't that bad. Right, it wasn't that dysfunctional as sometimes is pictured. And actually, these lands were also quite productive on their own. Right, they were a sound asset. Even think about the Kingdom of Cyprus. Think about the Kingdom of the Little Armenia. Right, this was another actually pain in the behind for the same Crusaders. These were, the Armenians of Cilicia that were, we made some videos about, and we will have to keep doing it, that were these basically refugees from the Seljuk invasions of Armenia, that the Byzantines had settled in Cilicia when they still controlled also Antioch, those areas there. These were actually, the Armenians were fighting for their own independence, but they often allied themselves as Christians, of course, against the Muslims, because they feared they would gotten crushed between the Crusaders, the Sultanate of Iconium. So they actually, or the Byzantine pressure that always aimed at reconquering those lands. They were even accomplishing that. This is particularly true for the end of the second half of the 12th century. So everybody had to watch their own back. And the same Crusaders, of course, were kind of competitive against each other, which, by the way, means, among other things, that even if this Muslim threat was so forever looming and dangerous, they would have probably at least allied themselves to counter it. And instead, think about the Battle of Hattin. Right, that was just a bad move, and it went unfortunately, and so they basically lost everything in one shot. But once again, if they had won, what? Right, normally if there is a battle, someone won and someone lost, it's either you or the enemy. And in that case, it was you. And guess what? We make war for conquering other people in general, and or at least driving them away or defeating them, and controlling the territory, etc. So in any way, so that's how it gone. But by itself, it doesn't mean much about a single deterministic cause about this major historical event. Just in general, by method, be always aware that whoever is trying to buy you with the isolating a single factor for explaining phenomena like the dynamics like these is wrong. By definition, it doesn't even matter if the point is making is good, right? But it's wrong because it lacks dimension, it lacks depth, and generally speaking, at that point, it's not really that good either, because it means that it doesn't take into account other stuff that is necessary to know the whole picture. And if you don't know the whole picture, what do you express the judgment for? Others say that the feudalism itself was kind of detrimental because, as we've seen, this ruling class was kind of competitive, right? Think about the king of Jerusalem with his vassals. I mean, it wasn't easy to control all of them, and this created lots of problems and division. But altogether, this wasn't much worse than what was happening in Europe, right? Of course, these states were something different. They weren't like England or France, right? They were not even as Castile or Aragon, but they were somewhat, structured at least to cope with that reality. Like a vassal wasn't fighting against his king, or at least being unloyal, because just of an internal factor that you can evaluate just within the kingdom itself. If he did so, it's also because he looked around at the neighboring Muslims and the other Crusaders and said, you know what, now I can do this. And they were managing a situation in which overall this local government was growing and being molded by. So I don't really think it was bad. Also, the myth, as we were saying before, that this was a modest territory. It was small. It didn't go much further. The coastal areas. Well, it's not really the case, right? Even if it was the case, that was actually an advantage, because you have a natural boundary, like the desert, right? Actually, at the height of the capital of Tripoli, there were Homs and Damascus that were in Muslim hands. So actually, those were the main problems, because those basically stand behind this major ridge of Lebanon that you have to cross to get there. So there are reasons, of course, why these things were kept by the Muslims, but also the Muslims had difficulties in that regard. For example, to connect Syria and Egypt, to keep, to coordinate it. So actually, the Muslims weren't faring that better. Like the main chunk of Muslim power in there was Egypt, and those were in fact the major opponents that, however, were bordering directly with Kingdom of Jerusalem, and that also was the tougher nut to crack there in the Crusader land. So the situation was fairly well balanced, and Palestine was fertile, Syria was fertile. So actually, what's the deal, right? Why was this territory poor? It was actually well urbanized. It was well served by the sea. Right, the Muslims, for example, didn't have as many naval forces as the Christians did. The Italian fleets were dominating the Mediterranean, and they could easily keep the logistical connections with Europe open. Right, the main problem there would be actually the Europeans themselves that weren't very participative to the Crusades themselves. Like they went there in small groups, and once in a while they came back to Europe, by the way. That was an important thing. Like, of course, there were Crusaders that remained and that started a new life there. They had children there, and those were tied to that land, especially those who had not much left in Europe, probably. So those were very committed. But this was perhaps one of the greatest problems, that these Crusader states had a lot of potential, and a lot of potential, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem. If you look at it, is very well defendable, but very well defendable, and simply in Europe they didn't give a damn more than much, because guess what? The Italians cared only about leaving the trade with the East open, right? Especially in the 13th century. European-Chinese relations were dramatically intense. The Italians were pioneering that. Think about Jan from Piano Carpini or Marco Polo, these figures. And we know Europeans that went to China, stayed in China, Dominicans, people sent missionaries, in fact, traders, etc. But the Italians, even after the Outremer states collapsed, remained there. All these avant-posts remained accessible. Look at Egypt. It was never conquered by the Crusaders. Well, the Venetians kept trading with Egypt all throughout the Crusader era, from centuries before and centuries after, right? And for them, it didn't change much, right? Of course, they, during the first wave, when the Crusaders conquered these areas, they were quite eager to conquer the place, because they would get much more benefits from the split of the spoils of war, right, than what the local Muslim rulers were willing to give to them. But this political blackmail that they did, for example, in Egypt, was quite evident at the same time. The same happened when they conquered Constantinople, when the French basically took the hinterland. The Venetians took the all the ports, because they didn't actually get damn about land. They just wanted the ports, and they were clever. The feudalism was, dealing with stuff on its own, right? The nobility was committed in the creation of this, new spaces, new models of government. The Near East perhaps wasn't, was less convenient compared to Europe, but also wasn't so inconvenient by itself. There, for those who were there, in this sense, we have to also understand what were the European horizons in terms of political unity, because if we don't consider this, of course, at this point, Europe was starting being conceived, like, especially from the 13th century, and possibly also in coincidence, in fact, with the fall of the Crusader states as something on its own, but Europeans largely didn't feel to be like Europeans. They thought they were Christians, mainly. And they didn't give much a damn about the geographical nature of Europe by itself. The same Crusader adventure showed actually was on the wake of, let's say, early medieval mindset that is, the Mediterranean is a Roman lake. It should be ours. It should be Christian. It should be part of the Roman Empire, right? Because we're kind of Holy Roman Empire now here, and from the other side there are those weirdos of the Byzantines that are kind of Roman as well, like, and there is just Christianity, right? We're this bunch of heathens there. They're just schismatic Christians. That was the mentality. Like, after the 13th century, it's different. After the 13th century, you see that the southern shores of the Mediterranean are Muslim, and the northern shores are Christian. So now you see what Europe is, but we're still very far from being actually, talking about the Europe we know now. And yet it's interesting to stress how that concept of Europe, and especially its narrowest concept of Western Europe, is born during the, let's say, the Ottoman invasions. The sense that, from one side there was Western Europe, from inside the Balkans with the Turks, and that was the idea, and that there is the other, and that's how Western Europe, strictly speaking, is being conceived. But at this point, the Westerners didn't say, we are Europeans, so we should all together think about, now controlling the whole Mediterranean, Near East, and everybody was thinking on their own. Every kingdom was thinking on their own. Even the Holy Roman Empire had this broader universalistic ambitions, but, they were still dealing with local stuff. In Germany, in Italy, there was still the Byzantine Empire. Up to a certain point, there was a problem. There were other powers also to think about. The Mongols. In the 13th century, you're a common Viennese person. You wake up and you find the Mongols at the gate. Things that happens in this sense. There is also this broader Eastern European dimension that is, this continuous tumultuous reality that never quite settles for a long time. At the end of the day, like Poland, Lithuania, and Russia merges to, more or less defined areas, but it's, still a huge frontier de facto. And very close up to Hungary, actually. And then, so what is Europe, even in here, and how and why, especially a Christian power that doesn't have a universalistic ambition per se, which is basically all the European countries except for maybe Germany during the 12th and France during the 13th centuries, do not really care about what happens in the Near East. Actually, they don't give properly a damn about it. Or even if they do, they see it as broader interaction with certain contingental interests. But, for a Castilian, what is the problem? Right? It's driving the Moors down south, and after Las Navas this happens, and the main problem is to deal with these Aragonese and other Navarre, what would become Portugal, and that's the main problem, right? You're thinking within, you're part of the Pyrenees fundamentally, and you that it ends there, right? These problems turn to be common when, in fact, the Ottomans start once again knocking at the door first of the Byzantine Empire, then of Serbia, then of Hungary, then of Poland and Bohemia, and that's starting being a problem, and Austria, etc. And that's where everybody starts to be more or less concerned. But before that, what did a Swedish colonist in Finland give about the Near East? I mean, seriously. I mean, of course, individually, he could find job there, but it was just one of the many opportunities in this regard. So it's actually very, very naive to pretend to see what happened in the Near East as the failure of either of the local adopted formula as copied from the West, or is in this sense a failure of the West as a whole. There was not that Western unity as we understand it. There was a broader Latin, Germanic, preeminence that, especially after the 12th century, was becoming about to swallow Europe, or at least to irradiate its own models, largely, even towards the east. But aside from this, there was not much of a coordination, and that cannot be considered as a failure if you understand what interests were at stake. That is, most people rightfully didn't care because they had more important problems to mind about at home. And yet, however, we don't have to underestimate in this sense how much the Near Eastern affairs were tied also to the ones at home. In the sense that it's obvious that if the Byzantines lost against Admirario-Kephalon in 1176, there was an immediate reflection in Europe, because of course the Hohenstaufen would gather power, right? It's obvious that even as we were saying last time, a relatively tiny feudal state like Montferrat in northwestern Italy, that was the tip of the balance basically of the whole European and Mediterranean politics. Its switching meant the crumbling fundamentally of an entire pro-Hohenstaufen. Think about how the Battle of Legnano, for example, influenced even the Near Eastern story. Think about even how Frederick II was necessary for the fate of the military orders that we'll see in a while. I mean, Frederick II represented the universalism, this idea that the Mediterranean once again could be reunited under Christian rule. It was a universalistic power that was in an anti-nationalistic sense, right? There was the Holy Roman Empire plus Sicily that he had gotten, that was opposed to France, for example. There was rising as a national monarchy, and, for example, all the Crusader states, the military orders that lived and were still in the Near East, being taken out by the Muslims because, they were, and now Jerusalem had fallen. We're looking at Frederick II, that is, come and save us, right? Because here we're about to be wiped out. That is an issue, right? That must be understood also in the eventually, when the Hohenstaufen fall, France will try to fill that gap. They will go in fact trying to invade Egypt, and still in a Crusader sense, but only here you see when the universalistic horizon takes over. The universalistic horizon fails in Europe by the mid-13th century. And guess what happens in the meanwhile? The Crusades end. So with the rise of national monarchies, actually, the Crusades are not seen as in the same way they had been seen before. As we were saying before, the Crusades continued, but in a different form, in a more kind of collegial fashion. Look at Nicopolis, look at Varna. These were important things now in kind of more a defensive sense, once again, right? That also didn't hide didn't conceal interests for trying to seize Constantinople in the process and extend their influence also. So it's really complicated. And once again, we can't reduce the Crusades to just, the failure of a formula, because the political picture is so complicated that the centrality of the Crusade that doesn't quite exist as such. Also, there is this idea that even local Christian communities were adverse to the Crusaders. Well, this is true also, right? The local Christians, after all, didn't mind excessively much whether to be under the Franks or the Muslims, right? Some of them, of course, had suffered persecution. Think about the Maronites. We made a video at our time. One of you commented telling me, you said it's as if, when the Franks fought against when the Maronites fought against the Franks, it's because they, it's not because they were together with the Muslims, as you implied, but because they were among civil war. Well, guess why? If the Maronites are in a civil war in the fight against the Franks, do you think the no-Muslim is behind them in any way? Of course they were. And of course the Maronites were ferociously anti-Muslim, and they wanted to remain within the orbit of the Papal state. But don't think even in here that, of the Roman Church, but don't think that that you can't draw this line just by saying, okay, these were Christian communities, hence they had to stick with the Crusades. You can't interpret Crusaders' history in this regard. I'm not referring to the guy who commented necessarily at that point, in part as well, but in general, right? This was not defined as an interreligionary war. This was a situation had been produced by some of the most unframeable dynamics of Western history that are the Crusades. No specialists on the Crusader states can actually explain the causes of the Crusades. We understand there were a ton of them, but we can't reduce it to one. And whoever is trying to do it is kidding, hopefully, because if he's serious, there's something seriously wrong as well with him. And there were naturally, the Maronites were kind of also more, they were kind of exceptional because they were together with the papacy, ideally. Other Christian confessions were not, right? It's not that the Roman Catholics were particularly fond of the Orthodoxes and vice versa, by the way. They really hated each other's guts. The greatest military success of the Crusades, after the first one, is arguably there were some, the fall of Constantinople. I know it sounds rough in that regard, but if you think about it, it's the Crusaders achieved what nobody had ever done. That is seizing Constantinople. Doesn't matter it was Christian itself, but it was a pretty that is an interesting story that is also poorly told, as if the evil Pope was like friction in his hands and saying ha ha ha, sending the Crusaders to attack Constantinople. It didn't go like that at all. Actually, it was the Byzantines who called, because of their civil wars, the Crusaders to march in Constantinople to represent the overthrown emperor. And actually was the Venetians who did most of the thing on their own. The Crusaders also agree on their own. When the Pope knew of it, when Innocent III knew of it, he was disgusted by what happened in 1204. But once again, everybody tells the story as if, look at those Crusades. They were going there in the name of religion. Look what they really wanted. Ha ha ha. Like, this is the normal criticism and the level of childish, historical, understanding of, and that's why you ask why do you make all these videos about the Crusades, wandering around about this stuff? Because these things should be told. Right, otherwise, why am I here for? Right, I'm also having a little fun sadistically speaking. No, I'm kidding. But once again, it's really important. An aspect that we didn't address last time, and instead it's very important, and we also have to expand in the military themed videos, is the one of the, in fact, of the military orders, of the monastic chivalric orders, wherever you want to call them. This story is also by itself boundless, because the origin of the religious orders is very complex, and it's also not easy to understand without a sound a prodrome, an explanation, a broader explanation of background, of context. But let's say that in Jerusalem, at least, there was the rise of a new type, let's say, of religious, even of military religious order properly, as such, because the idea of the knight that is also a saint is actually present since ever. Let's be honest about this, because think even about the military saints that were, and think about the Christian geography in early medieval times. Now, the military saints were usually Roman martyrs that had refused during the times of the ancient Roman Empire to serve in the Roman military, or better, actually, not to serve, because they were happy of serving the military, but they didn't want to kill. So, allegedly, which, looking at the picture of Christians in the Roman army back in the day, it's absolutely not like that. Like, it's like the picture of Christians in the Christian Roman armies, like that. But that's why I stressed the emphasis. You put the accent on the geography, because the geography naturally told, yeah, this guy didn't want to kill, so he was martyrized, and he became the military saint, because after all, he was a soldier. Now, a geography and popular culture in general transformed the saints in actual warrior saints. The reasons why this happened is it's very complex, and we will explain it in the medieval knighthood, the origins of chivalry video series. But it goes without saying that it's a pretty clear reflection of what the actual moral values of the times were. Right? There was nothing strange at that point to conceive a Christian military man that killed the enemies, right, of Christ, but also of the Christian society as such. And this is a mindset. We have seen it with Ambrose of Milan, that video we made, in which we explain how effectively the Christian military culture was born in that regard, to defend the Christian society, which is fair, actually, because if you look at the Bible, yeah, it's quite evident that albeit killing is a sin, there are also certain conditions for which naturally the world is contemplating war. And there is no clear prophecy that says, that Christians will not take arms, and that the whole role of the Christian doesn't have to be mundane with all that it entails, right? The Bible and the Gospels especially, can be interpreted quite clearly as a very sophisticated detachment of the two levels of human experience, that is the spiritual one and the earthly one, that naturally in mankind are all together. So it's obvious that there will be someone that will take arms, right? That is not to say that Christianity preaches that, because it doesn't, but it fuels definitely the responsibility that derives from having a conscience, and for evidently taking action in reality as you deem necessary, right? So what happens in Jerusalem now is that this is literally the kingdom of heaven, right? This is not like a kingdom like the others, and it's obvious that the monastic military orders are born chiefly from this pilgrim escort, just like the universities or other corporations in Europe. They were usually split among on the base of nationalities, right? That's also, for example, where Teutonic Order stems from. It was born in Jerusalem, in fact, and it and eventually went elsewhere. But it was basically a fusion between the ideals of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and the clash against the infidels and the defense of pilgrims, right? That were flowing continuously from Europe, and that did before the conquest of Jerusalem and did after the conquest of Jerusalem, right? The Islamic control of Jerusalem had basically nothing to do with the Christian pilgrim flow, right? There were some violence every once in a while, but no person with sensible government has Jerusalem cuts off the revenues of deriving from and the tolls coming from the Christian pilgrimage, because that's literally the largest business, right? I don't know about the trade the pilgrims' fluxes. Possibly the Muslims frequented Jerusalem more than Christians, but in general, there is no doubt about this. Christian people kept going to Jerusalem even after it fell in Muslim hands. We're talking about even noblemen, important people, and of course Muslim authorities were fine with that, and they even incentivized that, and there's nothing strange. But it's obvious that in the moment in which the Kingdom of Jerusalem becomes a state centered in Jerusalem, that becomes the capital of a dominion that has hostile Muslim neighbors, the military orders become a something more, right? They become almost an institutionalized creation. Naturally, they maintain as monastic orders their own degree of universality, but it's obvious that if you look at their names, the Hospitallers of St. John, right, that constituted in 1113, eventually they were named as the Knights of Rhodes, then eventually of Malta, so they even changed name according to the place they were defending gradually when Islamic invasion made them lose the original place. But the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, to entrusted to protect the tomb of Christ, the Knights of the Temple or Templars that were named like this in 1120 for the fact of having their own seat in an ex-mosque that was erected in the open ground of the Temple of Solomon, right? And so it's obvious that they have a specific Jerusalemetan character initially, but they still have also a universality in them, right? They have this origin gives them a character, right? A specific, let's say, it's a bit like having the patron saints. After all, it's like the Benedictines, and then eventually the Dominicans, the Franciscans. Like, yeah, here it's different. Also because there is not a real founder in this sense. So I presume that it would be very interesting, by the way, to study the relation between the Benedictine monasticism and the creation of the of this monastic rules, right, and see how they actually coped with the thing, because these were expressly military orders. So what is fascinating about them, if why most people like them, even in popular culture, is obviously the fact that these were elite, right? The task of these troops was, these were essentially knights proper, right? There were milites, then there were these other sergeants, there were like the aides and other people that had different degrees of monastic lifestyle, right? Um, it's like in the Teutonic Order that was founded in 1198, and that eventually was transferred first in Hungary, then it went to Poland, and that's where it started building its own state, probably the northeastern Europe. By the way, exterminating basically wherever they found in front of them. But they had the brothers of the sword. I mean, all these they were evenly corresponding to the knightly. And the squires, the serf, the field aides, all that were reflected in the monastic hierarchy in the same way. But the knights proper, the true, it's as if they had the whole monastic order had been hierarchically ordered, also in a military sense, and with all its tactical repercussions, so that they had basically every kind of trooper available. But the centrality is the one of the knight, just like it is in Western Europe at this time. Between the 11th and the 13th centuries, there is the predominance of cavalry on the battlefield, and it's at its highest, and it doesn't, the infantries are there. Actually, during Crusader warfare, infantry warfare was very important because but never decisive. This is the point of, let's say, between the end of the 11th and for all the 13th, up to the whole 13th century, that there is not the decisive role of infantry, but just an auxiliary one next to, actually behind cavalry, in this, or on the flank of, metaphorically and literally. But these knights are superior to others because they are spiritually trained. Right, all knights were spiritually trained, but these ones were much more fanatic in this regard. I mean, they were created oppositely to, just like monks stayed within the walls of the monastery. I mean, not quite literally, because many of them actually even went out, especially from the 13th century, but that in here were devoted to the military art. Right, so they were not knights by chance or by occasion, right? There were many. Think about the Murabids, in the Islamic world. I mean, there were always these kind of spiritually driven societies, communities that lived out the outskirts of in that case of the Dar al-Islam, in this case of the fringes of Christianity, that prepared spiritually for war. But the Christian military orders were dramatically structured and framed within a feudal hierarchy, right? I don't think the Muslims had anything similar in this regard. They had naturally very devoted and religiously driven people like the Christians that fought in arms as knights, etc. But I don't think there was ever the Muslim world rather produced this hordes of outcasts that were religious fanatics, a bit like the ones of the Poor's Crusades, a bit like these pilgrims in arms that were even considered during the 11th Crusade, that attacked the Turks just without armor, just with clubs, like beasts, and that were said to eat their corpses, right? We're talking about 11th century Europe. I mean, so paganism is literally yesterday, and human sacrifices together with it, and these things were actually done in those societies for real. So the military orders of Christianity are instead framed within a proper hierarchy, right? That also in the Muslim world is very difficult to find. The Muslim world is much more fluid, dynamic, and unstable. And it produces, in this sense, the strength, the zeal, the fanatism to fight for religious reasons. But very often this is confused with raiders, with people that are promised paradise just by joining the expedition, just for looting. And they're rabble. You can't even rely on them. They're even dangerous if you bring them back home. Christianity is building now instead a true respect for authority in a Christian sense, which in Islam doesn't quite exist, because in Islam whichever secular rule is always subject to a deep criticism, as saying, you're trying to usurp God's rule on earth, right? And this does create instability. Naturally, even in Islam, this happened for other reasons that are not just merely religious. There is a context here that is also difficult to explain in this specific video, but we addressed in the Islamic history playlist, a medieval Islam playlist. But it has to do with the decline of Islam in its centralized forms during the 11th century. I mean, it's deep, right? And we can't explain it now so easily. While the military orders of Christianity are really the knightly elite, but now selected for being devotees, and their tactical role is essentially conceived literally for killing as efficiently and as many as possible, as many enemies on the field, even if you are going to be killed in the process, right? A Templar Knight has the mindset that has to go in the midst of the fray. It doesn't matter how many the enemies are, right? There are many battles, we've seen them. We looked at the Battle of Crusade, other clashes in which, you look at these military orders that, for reasons that of course are not merely religious but also political, there were a lot of jealousies and competitions between the orders themselves and central power, that would charge Muslims who were 10 times them, right? And sometimes the sources exaggerate, but we don't have to think that the proportions were really that different, because, it was normal, for a Muslim army to have, a couple of thousand troops. Well, these military orders knights were very, very, very few already at home, right? So it's perfectly plausible that there were, just 100 charging an army of 1,000. And they were conceived literally for this, right? It also reflected properly maybe the pressure that was posed by these Islamic powers on the Crusader states. That is, we are chronically out of human resources, because this was probably the greatest military problem of the Crusader states. So we create these fanatics that are able to butcher tens of people, even if they're going to be killed, so that with their charge we can hope to accomplish much more than the average knight. This is what military orders conceived for. And naturally, they were also a very dear asset. Not all of them wanted to be killed, but when, for example, they were captured, we know they refused en masse to convert to Islam, and they were killed. And the Muslims were actually cruel towards them, unlike towards the others. They looked at the military orders as their fiercest enemies in a way, even beyond the police. And they knew naturally how many resources were invested in training these knights, right? In order to have a religiously fanatic and totally devoted and mortally devoted knight like that, you have to have a dramatic amount of money invested in his education, in his training, in his mentality, and that costs, right? It's an important strategic asset. So if you kill these guys, it's not even cruelty. It's just being pragmatic. You're going to get rid of them, and these are not knights that you can replace easily, right? Even if they spread in Europe as well. I mean, if you look at the Templars, they were scattered literally everywhere, especially in France, but also everywhere in England, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. I mean, they had hundreds of houses. And that's why they were disgustingly rich, at the point that when eventually, during the 13th century, the Outremer land is lost, the veterans are old people. They got weaker militarily speaking, and the French crown, as you know, puts them under trial for heresy and steals all their money in their houses, and it was pretty heavy blood. And that's these guys cared so much about the Holy Roman Empire and the Emperor and the Crusade of Frederick II, because they realized that the rise of the national monarchies would have actually wiped them out as universal orders fundamentally. So this is also a bit of perspective on the monastic military orders. And yeah, and I think we can stop it here. I don't think we should add more than this. We will keep talking about all this stuff again, because I realized that the more I talk about it, the more we should talk again about this. But just for now, hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.